Well, welcome to our 2024 Dairy Goat webinar series hosted by the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. My name is Jennifer Bentley, and I'm the Dairy Field Specialist housed in Northeast Iowa. And before we begin the webinar here today, today's webinar topic is focused on raising buck kids. Our presenter today is Carolyn Ihde. Carolyn serves as the new small ruminant outreach specialist for Iowa State University Extension and Outreach and has a dual role with University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension as well. So Ihde covers both Wisconsin and Iowa to bring research-based education and outreach programming to sheep and goat producers. She earned a Master of Science in Ag Education from Iowa State in 2015, and she was previously a livestock educator for UW-Madison of Extension in Crawford and Richland counties. In her previous role, she worked with small ruminant producers, extension educators, and specialists, engaging programs for beginning and experienced producers. So thanks for joining us on the webinar here today, Carolyn, and we're looking forward to hearing more about raising our buck kids. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and you can go ahead and share yours as well.
So my name is Carolyn Ihde, and today I will be presenting Raising Buck Kids, going back to the basics. I've been working with several groups of producers and beginning producers, and so this is kind of a presentation I put together to go back and talk about those basic things that help our kids grow to be healthy and strong. So this information can be relevant for raising doelings for replacements, as well as those buck kids for meat sales. So today we're going to talk about and cover colostrum and how that sets the stage for success, rumen development for the early smooth transitions from milk feeding to weaning, and then some vaccination protocols for against clostridial diseases that will help be successful. Because I think a lot of our deaths that we have in our goat kids can be prevented by improving on these three topics. And one of the key things that we need to make sure we're doing is keeping our equipment as clean as possible. This guide was actually taken from a milk series on how to keep our milking equipment clean, but it can translate into our feeding equipment because we are basically cleaning the same things, those milk proteins. And knowing that milk proteins when we wash them, we'll want to make sure we start rinsing with cool water to begin with, because when we wash milk proteins with hot water, they tend to stick to the surfaces that we're trying to clean them off of. So first, if we just rinse with cool water, so rinsing our buckets that we're feeding with, either if we're feeding with buckets or bottles or any of that equipment, and then follow that up with a washing with an alkaline detergent, and then physically scrub to break down those biofilms, because in the biofilms, that is where the bacteria will tend to grow. And we can wash in the hot water that's comfortable for us to wash in. So things that are not too hot, and also make sure that we're reading the label, because different detergents require different temperatures to be most effective. And after we wash, we're going to rinse with lukewarm water before we use a sanitizer or an acid solution, because our detergents are basic and our acids are acidic, and when we add those two together, we'll neutralize, and that won't have as effect as we want to actually effectively clean. And then we rinse in between because we don't want each other diluting. So this is just a quick reference on how to clean our equipment effectively, because if we have clean equipment, we're not introducing those bacteria into our stomachs of our young. And moving on. Perhaps we'll move on to the next slide. All right, like I said, we're going to talk about colostrum, and I know that we always are saying, make sure we're feeding colostrum, but I want to kind of go into why we're feeding colostrum and what colostrum is for those of us who are beginning into sheep or goat production, so that we can understand the basic importance of colostrum. And colostrum actually starts to be created in our females 3 to 4 weeks prior to the birth of the kids. So it's important to have a sound nutritional program for our females, and also to have a vaccination protocol that allows for transfer of immunity from the does to the kids. So the things that we want to have our kids have immune systems built from, we need to have that pass in through the colostrum. So, and the thing that we're concerned most about in colostrum are the IgGs, the primary immunoglobulins. So, and they have the ability to fight against the disease-causing organisms and their toxins. And we'll talk about clostridial diseases later on in the presentation. But we want to feed our colostrum as soon after birth as we can. And if we've been around kids when they've been born, we know that some of them get up and get going quite quickly, 10, 15, 20 minutes, and they're up trying to nurse their dam already. And those ones who have had maybe a difficult birth or a little weak, or maybe the cold has affected the birth, or we have other moms trying to interfere, we'll have to make sure that those kids are getting colostrum at 2 hours and before 6 hours. Those are really key numbers to remember. 2 hours is ideal, 6 hours is best. And then we can give them colostrum after that, but up until 24 hours, because 24 hours is another key number to remember, because after 24 hours, the stomach linings of the kids have closed down to those size of particles that are in the colostrum, and then passive immunity is not going to be as successful. And I know some of you are on dairy farms, and you are concerned about CAE and other things that may transfer to kids from colostrum. And your protocols will be a little bit different, removing kids from their mothers before they have a chance to nurse. But just know that we will also be feeding them a high quality powdered colostrum replacement as soon after birth as we can. And the other things that are in colostrum are fats and proteins. And knowing that the quality of our colostrums can differ between females, and just know that making sure that our kids are getting the colostrum that they need to get. Dr. Robert Van Son from Penn State University has a really good webinar that's recorded, and you can also access that to listen to his presentation about different qualities and quantities of colostrum and how that differs among our dairy and meat breeds. It's a really good, interesting webinar to watch, and he's one of our top small ruminant nutritionists to work with. When we're thinking about how much colostrum our kids should be getting within those first 2 to 6 hours and then out into 24 hours, they should be consuming 10% of their body weight. And I have a couple QR codes here. And one of the articles, it's a really nice article from Jennifer Bentley from Iowa State University, and that outlines the different aspects of colostrum feeding, and then also the QR code there for Dr. Van Son's recorded webinar about colostrum quality and quantity, and the 4 stages of feeding the dairy goat kid, which I really highly recommend everyone take a look at and watch. So normally the does will take care of their kids, but if you're removing them, then for artificial rearing, there are some differences that to do. But our buck kids also need high quality colostrum, just like our females do. And so that's a really important thing to consider on our large dairies, to making sure that our buck kids are getting that colostrum before they're transferred onto, maybe if they're going to be raised at a different location, giving them an equal chance to survive and build those immunities as our females as well. If we're concerned about the quality of our colostrum, we can test it with a Brix refractometer and to see if our colostrum qualities are as good as they should be. Colostrum milk replacers are good options that are in the powder form. And then we can also heat treat colostrums from our farms if we're worried about CAE, and then this also be fed to our buck kids. So feeding of our young kids from after that first 24 hours from colostrum milk, they should be fed at least 4 times a day because of their stomachs are small and unable to hold a lot of milk. And so having a full stomach of milk several times a day will help them to regulate their body temperature and help them to be able to start growing and get them off to the right foot. Because if we only feed them twice a day, they're going to build up some Clostridial pathogens, and we're going to talk about Clostridial pathogens later, but this can cause a lot of upset in their stomach and have them create bad eating habits for later. So making sure that we're offering them 4 feedings a day, and we can use milk replacer that is formulated for kid goats. We shouldn't be using milk replacer formulated for dairy calves or calves because they have different amounts of copper that they don't need. And you'll have the best luck with a kid milk replacer. And we could also use pasteurized cow's milk if that's an option for you. So feeding our kids from 2 weeks to weaning, and a goal of ours should be to wean around 6 weeks. However, we can wean a little bit later at 8 weeks, but the rule of thumb that we should be hitting for is that our kids are consuming almost like 3/4 to 1 pound of grain a day, and they have gained a weight of 2.5 to 3 times their birth weight. So those are kind of our goals that we should be considering. Although I do know some people wean at a little bit younger than that, but just making sure that our rumen has developed enough to be able to consume grain and get the nutrients from the grain that they need to. And that leads us into our rumen development portion. So we all know that goats are small ruminants, knowing that they have the 4 compartments to their stomachs. And this illustration shows the different compartments of the ruminant stomach. However, when a young kid or calf or lamb is born, their stomach looks a little bit different, and it's in a different components. This is also an image of an adult stomach, and so we can notice that the arrows show us the direction of the feed. And so the white arrows will go into the rumen, and that's where our forages will be processed. I could say processed, and that's like the vat that holds those. And our reticulum and omasum and abomasum have their jobs to do too, and we'll talk about them a little bit, but I just wanted to show you the direction of the flow of feeds. And looking inside, sorry, I've got pictures and screens all over my thing. So the different compartments of the stomach actually have different functions, and they have different types of surfaces. So the rumen is the largest stomach compartment and consists of several sacs. So the rumen is the storage vat. That's how we can think of it. And good supply to the rumen improves the absorption of volatile fatty acids. And the volatile fatty acids are actually the energy sources that the animals use. And tiny projections called papillae increase the surface area, and that's where the absorption of these volatile fatty acids happen. And when our young goats are first born, they do not have the papillae to be able to absorb the volatile fatty acids from grains and forages. And that's why we need to have a developed rumen before we can wean our young onto full feeds. So this is how the stomach looks when a young kid or calf or sheep is born. And you can see the difference that the abomasum is a lot bigger than the rumen at this time. And it acts more like a simple stomach, like a monogastric, similar to our stomach systems, our digestive systems. And so the important thing that they have that helps them do this, and this is a real picture of the esophageal groove. and it bypasses the rumen and the reticulum, and the milk is able to go directly into the abomasum where it is digested there. And this is the picture of the esophageal groove in a real stomach. So when the kid is nursing and swallows the milk, it activates this esophageal groove and it moves right into the abomasum. And that is where it has the correct enzymes to digest the milk. And when we are going from day one until weaning, there has to be a lot of change that happens in this rumen. And that's, I'm going to show you some pictures next of a calf stomach, a rumen, and it actually is very similar to a goat. And so we're going to look at a study done by Dr. Tara Montgomery at UW-Platteville. And I have some of her slides. I had a discussion with her the other day, and she wants to continue her work, but I think these slides will be a really good insight in how and why we want to feed grain and change the stomach from the milk only. So you can see how very small, how very small the papillae are and how less of a surface area they have to absorb those volatile fatty acids. So these three pictures are from a goat stomach, and you can see that the first one is a milk fed only. So this is the rumen development when we only feed milk. The middle picture is when the young is fed grain and milk, and then the third picture is milk and hay. And the pictures I'll show you from the study from Dr. Montgomery show very similar things in goat development. So their study was done with the same three different treatments, the milk only, the milk plus grain, and the milk plus grain. And the goats were harvested at 3, 6, and 9 weeks. And I wanted to show you these slides because of the progression that you can see and the development of the rumen. And this is a microscopic slide view of the papillae, and you can see how they grow and change over time and how much more surface area they have at 6 weeks to absorb those volatile fatty acids. And that is how they are getting their energy for growth and development. And another picture way to look at this is the actual papillae and microscopic views of that as well. And so this is a picture of the rumen and actually the stomach of a goat at the very beginning. So they all looked very similar. So they were light colored with very small papillae development. And these are images at the very end of the study. And this one in the lower left is the goat that was fed grain, and on the top right is milk only. And I will show you a few more slides of how those developments changed throughout. So this is obviously a goat at 3 weeks of age and with milk only. And again, notice how small the papillae are and the color. And this is comparing to one that has had grain, and we can start feeding grain to our goat kids at 1 week. We can start offering them grain, and they will start to nibble on that and pick and start to develop the rumen, because it's actually the ingestion of the grain and the development that triggers the papillae. And then we can see at 6 weeks of milk only, we still have very little development. And at 6 weeks with milk and feed, a lot more development. And at 9 weeks, we are starting to see some papillae in through the region, but the color is quite different. And so the activity of the papillae are less. And then I think this is quite an interesting picture of all the papillae that have developed in that stomach and the rumen at 9 weeks on the goat that was fed with milk and feed. And so the conclusion that they made that there were clearly some differences. And so then they theorized that the larger the stomach, the more capacity for feed, and that should result in more growth. The only thing that they were kind of wanting to increase their knowledge as to how would this affect their long-term growth, because they harvested these kids at the 3, 6, and 9, and they'd like to do another study moving forward on how that different types of rumen development goes on through until harvest. So thinking about some common things to vaccinate for, mostly we want to vaccinate for our kids and our adult does for CD and T. Some other things that we can vaccinate for are CL, which is Caseus lymphonitis, which are the abscesses that we do see, sore mouth and foot rot, and Manhamia hemolytica and Pasteurella monocotta. And those are some of our pneumonias. So CD&T, or otherwise known as overeating, is actually endotoxemia, and it's one of our biggest killers of our kid goats, and it's caused by the Clostridial perfringens bacteria, which is actually not usually, but it's present in the intestines of our goats, and it's in a balance. And what happens for overeating to occur is a goat will over ingest a highly starch forage, or actually a grain, and that will over stimulate the growth of the Clostridium perfringens, and then they start to become toxic and release into their bloodstream, and that's what kind of causes the disease. And so signs of the disease would be the animals are off feed. Maybe we don't see them come up to the bunk. They become lethargic, and they might also show signs of stomach pain. So maybe they're kicking at their belly, getting up, laying down, laying on their sides, panting, maybe crying out in pain. In some cases, there may be diarrhea, and animals may lose their ability to stand, lay on their sides, extend their legs, and they may lift their head and neck extended back over their top. And this is what happens when the toxins begin to affect their brain. And death usually occurs within minutes to hours after these signs. So these are the kids that maybe at morning feeding, they were looking great. And then you come in at the afternoon feeding and they are already dead. In our adult animals, it may take a little bit longer for Clostridial diseases to take them down, but they also have the similar symptoms. And so the place that our young get immunity to Clostridial diseases are in a couple of different ways. Remember when we were talking about our colostrum, and that's such an important way for them to get immunity. That is where they're going to get immunity from their overeating diseases. And so when we vaccinate our does 3 to 6 weeks before they birth, they are able to put those immunities into the colostrum, and that would help prevent these Clostridial diseases. And also after, when kids are 3 to 4 weeks old, we should be actually vaccinating them for CD and T themselves, and then following that up in 21 to 28 days with the booster vaccine to make sure that they're fully covered. And kids that are bottle fed will need to be vaccinated maybe one or two times more. And this is something that you should work with your veterinarian to create a protocol that works best for your operation and those things that you are seeing on your farm. And another thing you can do to help prevent Clostridial diseases is making sure that when we're feeding our animals, especially on a creep feed, that they have access to creep feed at all times, because it's those times when they run out of feed and they come to, and then you put feed in the creep feeder, they rush the creep feeder and they eat too much. And so now they have just ingested a high starch or sugar feed, and then those Clostridial vaccine or Clostridial pathogens will kick up and cause that toxicity. So making sure we're always consistently feeding creep feeds and bottle feeding. That's another way they can have clostridial diseases, is when they're overconsume their milk products or milk replacer. So making sure that we're always on a consistent feeding schedule will help also with that. And then if you're going to change your diet, say to a different types of feed, a different type of hay, or a different concentration of protein, do that slowly over several days so that they are able to adjust to the different types of feed that they're going to be consuming. If you're having your dams raise their own kids, sometimes those of our dams who are really heavy producers could also have young that have clostridial diseases, because if they get a full stomach of milk, they may go and lay down and then kind of hang out and then like, oh, I'm hungry again. And then they may overeat when they're nursing their dam as well. So the vaccine that we use for overeating is also usually combined with a tetanus, and that is to help prevent Clostridium tetuni. And that bacteria gains entry in the bottom into the body through a break in the skin, such as when we band or dehorn our lambs and goats. Sorry, I keep saying lambs. I do a lot of work with lambs. So when we band our goats or disbud them, then they can have openings in their skin. And the tetanus pathogens live in the environment. And so another good thing would be making sure that our environments are clean as well. And tetanus can be transmitted to humans. So we make sure that we are taking care to make sure we're washing and sanitizing things and being careful if we were to have an outbreak of tetanus. And so the symptoms are rigid muscles with muscle spasms and death, and there's typically not a successful treatment program for that. And some tips and tricks for vaccinating. So we do not want to vaccinate wet animals because this might predispose them to abscesses. Keep our refrigerated vaccines refrigerated. Be sure that they're not exposed to excess heat, sun if we're working our animals outside. Swab the top of the bottle with alcohol before you insert a sterile needle into the bottle. And if you're concerned about diseases as CAE, CL, you can help to prevent the spread by always using a new needle for each goat, and then making sure that only clean needles are inserted into the vaccine bottles. Do not mix vaccines with other vaccines or drugs at the time, so they should be only singly injected. Read all and follow all labels for meat withdrawals. Read labels for safety concerns. Another thing that can be spread from animal to animal is sore mouth. Keep up-to-date records of vaccination dates, and then dispose of your needles in a sanitary manner. So I was been talking to different groups of producers about raising buck kids for meat production. And it's a topic of interest for a lot of people, because normally our buck kids, we see them maybe as an opportunity to gain some income on the farms. And so it'd be interesting to know how different producers are producing their buck kids. And there's a survey from UC Davis who wants to know more about how our buck kids are being raised. And if you'd like to participate in this survey, you can connect with the QR code with the link, or you can also email me for more information. And I know this survey is closing pretty soon, so if you'd like to participate, please let us know or go ahead and access it. And I would like to also if any of you guys are interested in doing research on how we can gather some benchmarks on basic weight gains, marketing, and helping us to make a little bit more money on these buck kids when they're going to market, please let me know. And I'm interested in doing some on-farm research or a survey as well on how we can best grow and market and utilize these buck kids as a source of incomes for our farm. And actually, I think we're going to have a very short presentation today. Usually I have a lot of interaction and questions, and doing that on a webinar, it's not as much. So Jennifer, and that's all I actually have prepared today, but I can cover some more things or answer questions if you would like.
All right, thanks. Well, I do see one Carolyn in here talking about automatic milk replacer feeders. They've seen them work pretty successfully. Do you have any comments or thoughts on the automatic? I'm sorry, I said automatic calf feeders, didn't I? Automatic milk replacer feeders. Yep.
Yeah, it's very easy for those other words to come in. Yes, so I believe the automatic milk replacer feeders are really, they're great, but I know that they're quite expensive, but it depends on the size of your farm. They work really well if you have a source to clean them close by, because they do need cleaned as well. And if you're able to get enough spots for each lamb to have not each one to have access, but for enough access points for the number of goats that you have, because they're going to automatically keep up with the demand. But you also have to make sure that those shy or less aggressive kids, when they come to the feeder, that there's a spot for them. So I think they are very successful, but we have to make sure that we're keeping them clean, that they work with our system. And I know that I think you have to have about 40 to 60 goats per feeder to keep that milk fresh enough. That's what I do. Yep.
So Carolyn, are there sizes like of group pens? I get on some goat farms and there's, 8 to 10 in a group. I get on some, sometimes 40, 50, 60 in a group. Is there some ideal size we're looking at?
Yeah, space-wise, like square feet wise?
Well,
Is that what you're asking?
both square feet, and just, what's the limit on how many per pen?
Well, I know a lot of,
size, but...
yeah. So I know a lot of guys like to house them, which matches their bucket size. So I work with some producers who use a bucket that has maybe 8 or 9 nipples on it. And so they will group them in groups 8 or 9, which works well because when they bring the pail in there, everyone has a spot to nurse. And I would think that would be ideal. I've also worked with a few producers who have a larger pen and smaller buckets, and they continually have cold milk available to them all times. And I'd like to see a little bit more how that's working for them, because I did notice the sizes of their goats was a little bit more, not quite as even as it could be, but that could be solved by maybe sizing and sorting your groups when you put them together. So making sure that when we group our goats together, we're getting in consistent age groups, because it's really important. When we saw with the rumen development, even a week or two different in age can be quite a bit of difference in their development of their rumen. And so we wouldn't want to be asking a 2-week-old goat to be performing at the same rate as a 4-week-old goat and competing with that. So if we're able to bring in a group of goats that are all the same age, making sure that they're sized and aged similarly, and that when we're weaning, that they are eating that pound of grain and up to 2.5 to 3 times their birth weight. So I think it just depends on your facilities, because of airflow and ventilation and overcrowding. And when it's colder, the goats are going to use each other for body heat. But we also have to make sure that we're not overcrowding so that they're piling up on each other and smothering each other, because we can get too many in a pen and some smaller goats could get smothered. So I think it's going to depend on what your feeding system is and the airflow in your barn and how warm it is, how many you can keep together. But I really liked the ones that had about 10 per pen, because I think producers can get a really good eye on a group of 10. But if we do more than that when they're small, then it's hard to keep an eye on each one and make sure each one's doing good. So I hope that answered your question, Larry.
Yeah, very well. So thanks.
Yeah, I do have a chart probably at my fingertips somewhere with sizing. So it's like square foot, but I'd have to dig that up. Just if you want to give me a second.
Yeah, so
But
while
are
you're
there any
looking
other
at that,
questions?
Carolyn,
Yeah.
yeah, so if anybody else is wanting to ask any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, or you can also unmute yourself as well if you want to ask that verbally as well. I'm not seeing any new questions in the chat.
I've also created a kind of a receiving protocol if people are bringing in groups of bucklings to raise. So that's something they can connect with me, and I can go over that with individuals, and I can send them one. It just kind of goes through like on day one, if you're receiving a bunch of goats, what you should be doing and how to transition them on their feeds and their milk replacers. So if that helps, I can share that with anybody. And do you have my contact information? Sorry, go ahead.
Somebody asked about the contact information. I was just going to ask if you wouldn't mind just even going through a couple of those little simple protocol about bringing them on feed.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I can just start where the protocol starts. And so it starts back, like I said before, 3 to 6 weeks before they're born, making sure that our does have been vaccinated with the CD and T. And then a week before you receive a group in, you should clean and disinfect your pens and your buckets and all the feeding equipment. And if you're working on a floor that's not concrete where you can't sanitize it as well, you can also use barn lime to spread down and make sure that we're keeping it as clean as possible. And then we didn't talk about bedding, but that's another thing that we can talk about coming out of the colder weather that we've had, is making sure that the pen is bedded down with 6 or more inches of clean and dry bedding, because the bedding is going to do a couple of different things. It's going to help them regulate their body heat with that air that's up in the bedding. So it's going to insulate them and make them help them be able to stay warmer. And then it's also going to absorb their waste materials. And when those urine starts to break down, it releases ammonia. We know that because our barns can sometimes get kind of a smell of that. But also when the ammonia starts breaking down, it adds warmth. But we have to make sure we're having an equal balance between the ammonia that's creating heat and the ammonia that's creating bad air, like if I could say bad air, because ammonia buildup in the bedding can lead to lung damage later on. And so that's kind of what we call barn cough. And barn cough is actually the damage to their lungs because of the ammonia. So we want to make sure that our pens, before we receive them, are bedded down. And then throughout the growing process, keeping the pens cleaned and dry and well bedded. And it depends on the age in which we're receiving the goats. So if they're coming in straight off the farm when they're wet, we'll want to make sure if they're under a day old that we're getting them the colostrum. We're checking and dipping navels with an iodine product. Even if they're up to, a little bit older than that, we'll want to make sure that we're checking their navels, because the navel is a way for pathogens to enter the body. And just like in calves, we can get joint ill. And we want to make sure that we are preventing that as much as we can. Depending on where you're located, an injection of Bozy may be something that you'll have to do. I know that in Iowa, most of our soils are adequate with selenium, but some places in Wisconsin, they're not. And so that's something that a conversation with a veterinarian or a nutritionist may be something. If you're testing your forages in your grain and your does are receiving the adequate levels, you may not need to be injecting with Bozy. And Bozy is our treatment for white muscle disease. And white muscle disease can affect their regular muscles, which I call the regular muscles, or their cardiac muscles. And that if they are damaged with their cardiac muscles through white muscle disease, that's something that they normally can't overcome, and it's really kind of detrimental to them. Feeding, like I said before, feeding 4 times a day. And then another thing that I would encourage producers to do would be to weigh and record the weights of their goats when they receive them, so that they can chart growth. Because one way we measure if they're ready for weaning is if they have increased their body size 2.5 to 3 times their weight. And so if we are able to weigh and record them, then we're able to understand how our systems are working and how the goats are growing. And so that we can make decisions based on their growth. Begin offering water and creep feeding as soon as you receive them in. And like I said before, size and sort. And those individuals that we are bottle feeding will need to be vaccinated. And if we're getting goats from herds that we don't know the health status of, if the females have been vaccinated, we can go ahead and vaccinate those goats that are over 7 days old for CD&T. And Dr. Montgomery also suggested that even if we do know the health status of the herd, if we're bringing goats in to be raised on the bottle or a milk replacer, that we should be vaccinating them at day 7 or so, because their immune system is going to be a little bit suppressed because of the stress of moving from one farm to another. And it's great to know that they have had that vaccine, and you can repeat in 21 to 28 days. And it's mostly suggested that bottle fed lambs or kids have actually 3 to 4 rounds of CD&T to help them build that immunity and keep it going. And then once they are 21 days old, you can increase the amount of feed that they're getting and decrease the times. So you can move down to 3 times a day feeding, and just make sure you're monitoring their weight, their body condition score, making sure they're growing. And then if you're not going to wean at 4 weeks, if you're going to extend that out to the 8-week feeding time, you can decrease the feedings down to 2 times a day at days like 43. And day 49 is another day that you can do a weight on them to make sure that they are up to that 2.5 to 3 times body weight, and that they're eating a pound of grain, and then work at weaning them. So that's what the protocol says.
Thanks for sharing that, Carolyn. And I could include that with a follow-up email if you have a document that we could share out to the group. They can further read that. And I'll also include your contact information with the follow-up email, so they can certainly reach out to you via email or phone if they have more questions on that. I just had a question on the colostrum management. When you're talking about, I think earlier in your presentation, you said measuring it on the Brix refractometer. I know in the dairy calf world, we use 22% as our cutoff on the Brix refractometer. Is there a different cut point for dairy goat colostrum?
We're actually, that's what Dr. Van Saan's research and his information covers. And he has the question that is, if the same numbers that we use on the dairy cattle size, if they're adequate for their dairy goats and sheep. And so I think you could get a better understanding of that information by watching his webinar. He has a lot of different charts that show the measurements. And it's really interesting, I think, to know that maybe our meat breeds of goats, and actually sheep, because he goes into sheep, have higher IgG concentration than our dairy females do. And so sometimes even our dairy females are not adequate enough in their IgG concentrations. So he explains it a lot better, and he actually did the research. So I would really highly suggest watching his webinar.
Thanks, Carolyn. Are there any other questions or comments from the group? Well, I don't see any other comments or questions coming in, Carolyn. So I want to thank you for being on our webinar here today, and appreciate everybody being on the webinar. And thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you all soon.